SIPS is being independent, being apolitical, being we welcome all theories, and we go out of the box all the time. And now we will be destroying some myths that exist around. Genetically modified food, has been a lot of, noise, a lot of theories, a lot of people view them as not good for the human health, as not good for the quality of life. But genetically modified food, they come from science. So it's science that modified food in order to increase productivity, to increase quality. Now, are we against science and to drop this? The issue is, if there are some disadvantages, they can be fixed by science also. And here we are with demystifying the genetically modified food practice and theory, Professor Roberts, Nobel Laureate in medicine.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully my slides will show up eventually. It's a pleasure to be here. It was very nice to hear about life from a physicist. I'm not going to try and tell you any physics, though, but we can talk later. So, first of all, let me say, I do not work in the agriculture field. My field is molecular biology, is bioinformatics, bacteria, but I will tell you in a moment how I got involved in this. One of the things that we just heard about was climate change. We know it's just devastating life as we know it. Climate change is affecting every single one of us. It's causing major problems. And finally, it looks as though maybe in Europe, it's also causing a few problems. We have to remember that plants need the appropriate environment if they're to grow successfully. I noticed that in France, champagne is no longer easily grown. The grapes for champagne are no longer easily grown in France. Rather, they're now moving the grapes over to the southern part of England to accommodate climate change. And we should always remember that for the 800 million or more people who go to bed hungry every night, they're not interested in advanced medicines, they're not interested in advanced pharmaceuticals. They need food. Food is medicine for them. We should also remember that greenhouse gases really cause major problems, and there are ways in which, if we engineer crops, we can solve this problem too. We can arrange for plants to suck more CO2 out of the atmosphere. And the term genetically modified organism is really misleading. Every life form on this planet, including us, have been genetically modified. Our parents didn't produce one of them, they rather produced a hybrid between the two of us. Plant and animal breeding has been practiced for centuries. We just heard agriculture started really several thousand years ago. And what's happened is by traditional breeding methods, we've been making changes all the time. And I will tell you that that is not the best way to do it. If you want to do something more precise, you have to use an alternative technique. Hypocrisy is probably the worst aspect of the anti-GMO movement. For instance, when diabetics take insulin, they take human insulin. Where do you think that comes from? Do you think humans are going around donating this insulin? No. The human insulin comes from a genetically modified organism. We take the gene for human insulin, put it into a bacteria or a yeast, and then we can produce as much human insulin as needed for diabetics. Why are the anti-GMO people not opposed to that? Similarly, why did they accept these vaccines for COVID-19 so quickly? Within 12 months, you know, the Europeans claim the precautionary principle. Oh, we mustn't do anything fast. And yet, it is genetic modification of organisms and the production of enzymes and then messenger RNAs that has made these vaccines go so fast. But perhaps one of the worst aspects of all of this is that the Europeans import millions of tons of GMO products every year to feed their animals. Apparently, this is perfectly okay. These GMOs that are going to kill us, they're not going to affect the animals at all. This is perfectly okay. This is what I mean by hypocrisy. I want to tell you how I got started on this. Gentleman on the right here, Mark Van Montague, has been a good friend of mine since 1975. He used to come to my lab at Cold Spring Harbor to get enzymes that I was working on at the time. And for his 80th birthday, they put on a big celebration in Ghent. And Mark, along with Jeff Shell and independently Mary Dale Chilton, discovered the GMO method of improving plants. And so they put on a big celebration for his 80th birthday, and I'd been asked to go and go to it, talk to it, listen to the symposium. And so at the end of it, I was appalled that everyone who spoke at the symposium from Europe all said the same thing, that Greenpeace would send people to the meeting, they would try to harass them, they'd try to stop them, they were importantly trying to stop funding for any GMO research. And most of this GMO research was aimed at improving crops, a great deal of that in the third world. After the meeting, I'd been asked to go and talk to the European Commission about the future of medicine. Well, I don't particularly know a lot about the future of medicine. I know what's in the literature. I could talk a little bit, but I decided I would go, and instead of talking about the future of medicine, vaccines, and so on, I decided to make the argument that food is medicine, and that if we really want to help the poor people in this world and allow them a sustainable future, we have to do something to make sure they can grow the crops and feed themselves. You know, contrary to what Danny Schechter told you the other day, the world's population is growing up, and especially in Africa, where by the end of this century it is anticipated that there will be more Africans than Asians. They're going to overtake the population of India and China. And they have a real problem with food. And so I thought, well, I'll talk to the European Commission about this, and I gave a very brief version of what I'm going to tell you. And afterwards, an Italian senator, a lady who had been listening, came up to me and she said, I had never heard this before, because they don't talk about it in Europe. The anti-GMO people have the stage, and all they do is talk about it. And so she came up to me and she said, well, after what you'd said, I'm going to change my view. I had been opposed to GMOs, now I'm going to be in favor. And goes back to the Parliament and is in favor. And several members of staff from European Commission members who were there said the same thing, that I'd just never heard this stuff before. And so I thought, well, maybe this is something that we can do as Nobel laureates. And I talked to a few of my friends. I said, what about we start a campaign showing that GMOs, claiming GMOs, talking about the science, because the science says GMOs are perfectly safe. Since they first were started 35 years ago, there has been not one single problem, not one problem that you can attribute to a GMO. You cannot say the same for traditionally bred foods. And so we started the campaign, and we now have 160 Nobel laureates who've all signed on, who all agree that GMOs are okay. We sent a letter to Greenpeace and to several other anti-GMO movements. Of course, they never bothered to get back to me. We sent the letter to every UN ambassador. asking them to please accept the science. You know, you fund science, why don't you listen to us? Listen to the science. And I rather like this cartoon on the right, which was put out by a newspaper in Iowa, and he's looking and saying, well, you know, what the anti-GMO people are doing, they're telling these young kids in Africa who do not have enough food, do you know what this is going to do to you? Don't eat this GMO food. The guy's hungry, the little boy is hungry. He says, yes, he knows what it will keep him alive. And we have a website, supportprecisionagriculture.org. On there you can see the names of all of the Nobel Laureates who've signed on, and you can also join us. You can sign on yourself and say, yes, I support this movement too. Now we have to recognize that food means agriculture, and agriculture is absolutely necessary if we're going to grow enough food to feed people who live in cities. You know, if you're out in the rural community, maybe you've got a field and you can grow your own food. But if you live in a high-rise building, you cannot grow your own food. We need agriculture, we need the agricultural companies to be growing it and to provide it. And some 10, 12,000 years ago, people realized that you could, in fact, not have to go out into the forest and harvest everything, but you could grow it in your backyard, and then you could grow it in big fields, and then people started to engineer it. They started to make crosses. If you look at the evolution of maize, corn, if you look at the picture on the left, this wild ancestor, it's got about 10 grains on it. This is teosinte. This was the origin of corn. And what we've done in Central America primarily, and most recently in the developed world, we now have corn that looks like this. You go to the supermarket and you see these big corn cobs. This is genetic modification. This is breeding that we've done over the years. Now, I just want to briefly show you the difference between conventional breeding, traditional breeding, and the GMO method. In conventional breeding, we take a plant that we're already growing in our farms and in our fields. We take a related variety that has some desired trait. Maybe we want the grains to be bigger. Maybe we want the plant to grow taller so that it's easier to harvest. And typically, we can find 1 or 2 genes that do that. And you make crosses among, say, a wild ancestor that has this trait that you want, and then you get the hybrids. 50% of the genes came from one, 50% from the other. And you take the variety that you want that has picked up this trait, and then you keep crossing it back to the elite variety. And if that doesn't work, then you mutagenize. Use chemicals, use X-rays, whatever, to make mutants that will have the desired trait. That's the traditional way of breeding. And this is what Greenpeace says is safe because we've been doing it for years. On the other hand, the GMO method, precision breeding, shown here on the right, we say, well, let us find the gene that we want, put it onto a small piece of DNA that is in a plasmid, in a bacterium, and we put it into Agrobacterium tumefaciens, which is what Jeff Shell and Mark Van Montague and co. discovered. This was the way you could get genes into plants because this bacterium does it naturally. It takes its own genes and puts them into the plant to allow it to grow. And so Mark and co. said, well, what if we put our gene into this bacterium? Will it transfer it into plants? And yes, sure enough, it does. And in this way, we can be very precise. We can take the one gene, this blue gene, that we want, we put it on a small piece of DNA, and Agrobacterium will put it into the plant for us. This is what is apparently so dangerous. Here, we know exactly what we're doing. We know where the gene goes. We can follow it. We can see what's happening. And yet, the anti-GMO people will tell you this is terribly dangerous. I like to use this analogy. It's gone down very well, both with scientific and non-scientific audiences. And that's, what if I've got a GPS system, a gene, in one car, and I want to move it into another one? Do I take the 2 cars apart, mix everything up, and then hope that the one that's picked up the GPS is going to be really good? Oh, no, of course I don't. I unplug the GPS and I put it into the car. That is the GMO approach to making plants. What if I take the GPS from an airplane? Is that going to make the car fly? Well, I think we obviously know that is rubbish. You listen to the anti-GMO people. They will tell you, take a gene from a salmon, you take it from somewhere else, you're going to import all sorts of new properties on the plant. But really, this is what's important. It's important, it's the product that's important. It's not the method. It doesn't matter how you do it. When a lady goes into a shop to buy a nice dress, does she say, oh, how was that made? I'm not going to buy that if that was made by this method. No, you look at it and you say, hey, this is a very nice dress. Her husband says, beautiful, buy it. The product is what's important, not the method. And this is something we need to focus on, because this is true not just for GMOs, it's true for regular plants too, for regular products. Now, in light of all of this, and the fact that we really do not need GMO products in the developed world, Europe, the US, we don't need genetically modified crops, but in the developing countries, they do. The reason we don't need them is because the agricultural companies have spent years and huge amounts of money to improve the crops that we eat in the developed world. They've spent no time, no money, no effort trying to improve the crops that are eaten in the developing world because they couldn't make money. They can only make money when you sell them to a rich consumer. And you might ask, why doesn't Europe think that this is a good idea, that by allowing GMO methods to be used in order to improve the crops in the developing world when they don't need them themselves, why don't they endorse it? Why don't they think this is a good thing? Well, you always have to ask, when people do things, why do they do it? Is it politics? Is it money? Or is it both? I will argue in this case it was both. Europeans didn't want the US companies to control their food. They were buying lots of seeds from Monsanto, from other big agribusinesses. And then Monsanto tried to introduce a GMO seed into Europe, and Greenpeace and the anti-GMO folks seized on it. And they said, well, we can't just ban Monsanto, but we can ban GM crops, and this will hurt Monsanto. And this is what they did. They couldn't just ban Monsanto completely, just the GMO crops that Monsanto were trying to push on them. And so the Green parties, this is the way they came up with it. They said, oh, precision breeding, maybe that's dangerous. Maybe this GMO stuff is dangerous. And then they go off and they talk about Frankenfoods, Frankenstein foods. They talk about all of the dangers that could come. They hire Hollywood producers to produce movies to scare everybody. And we know Hollywood are very good at scaring people. And they use the money from their donors in order to support a massive anti-GMO advertising campaign. Could we respond as scientists? Well, I don't know about you, but the grants I used to get never had money for advertising how good our science was. We just don't have the money to compete with this kind of thing. And the beautiful thing from the point of view of the Green parties was that this had no effect whatsoever, no consequences for Europe, because they didn't need them. When you go to the supermarket in any European country, you have a big choice of food, whatever you want. But the Green parties, instead of saying, well, we just don't want them, they said, we're dangerous. And then they got political power and claimed that this was going to save the population by banning GMOs. They also like to invoke the precautionary principle. You know, the precautionary principle is kind of interesting. It didn't apply to insulin and so on, and vaccines and the things I mentioned before. Also, interestingly, it doesn't apply to cell phones. I bet everybody in this audience has a cell phone. Do you know how dangerous cell phones are? Not because of anything that's going on in your ear, but because of the light that is transmitted from the screen that affects the macula in your eyes. And this is now causing macular degeneration to be discovered in young people. Young people spend hours just staring at their cell phones. Were the Europeans concerned about this? Apparently not. So, you know, the precautionary principle is a little bit vague. And you have to ask, how much evidence is enough? You know, I could agree when Greenpeace first came out and said maybe these things are dangerous. One of the things they did is they said we must do some experiments. We must make sure that this is safe. Well, those experiments have been done. Everything says they're safe. So why don't Greenpeace now come out and say, hey, we asked for the scientific evidence. You did the science. You scientists responded. Why don't they just come out and say, we were right all along and approve GMOs? Well, I think the reason is, again, money. This has been the best fundraising that Greenpeace have ever managed. And of course, the tragic consequences is that anything you say these days in Europe or anywhere else, that maybe you say it for political reasons, it pretty soon rebounds around the world. And so Greenpeace went out and talked to the leaders in Africa, in South America, in Asia, and convinced them that GMOs were dangerous. I just want to take a few case studies. There's a nice case study of something called golden rice. If you're a young baby, in the first 2-3 years of your life, if you don't get enough vitamin A, you have major problems. Your vision doesn't develop properly. You can easily go blind. Your immune system doesn't develop properly. And something like 2 million people every year, 2 million young people, either go blind or die because of vitamin A deficiency. A man called Peter Jennings in 1984, a long time ago, came up and he said, well, why don't we put the gene for beta-carotene, which is the precursor of vitamin A, why don't we put that into the grain in rice? And in this way, we could make sure that people who eat rice, which is many, many people in the developing world, would get adequate amounts of vitamin A. That sounded like a great idea. 2 scientists in Europe, Ingo Petraikas and Peter Bayer, said, yes, we'll do that. Let's get that going. It took them a little while, but in 1999, they had made it a reality. 23 years ago, it was a reality. Typically, if it had not been a GMO, it would have been out in the field and improved and available within 2 to 5 years. But it's a GMO. And Greenpeace launched this massive campaign to try to stop its development, because I think they saw that it was almost like a pharmaceutical, like human insulin. And it's very difficult to be against pharmaceuticals that are actually saving people. It only recently became available in the Philippines this year, and we hope that by next year there will be plenty of golden rice growing so that the children in the Philippines who need vitamin A can actually get it from this. Of course, Greenpeace came up with this thing. They said it's science fiction. They called it golden illusion. They said it's taken so long to develop it can't possibly work, failing to mention that they were the ones who made sure that it took so long to get it developed. Again, this kind of hypocrisy that you find in these movements, I find appalling. Since 2005, millions of children have died or suffered because of vitamin A deficiency. How many have to die before we say this is a crime against humanity? Seems to me an awful lot of children. This is not right. Here's another interesting case. In Uganda, bananas are extremely important. They provide about 30% of the calories. But they're actually a little bit difficult to grow. They suffer from many diseases, one of which is Xanthomonas wilt. There are 2 genes, well, there's no natural banana that is resistant to it. So you can't use traditional breeding to bring in the genes to make it resistant. But sweet pepper has 2 genes, and it is resistant to Xanthomonas wilt. If you move those genes into bananas, they're resistant too. I'll tell you a rather sad story here, that this was approved by the Ugandan parliament, went to the Ugandan president to get his signature because all such bills have to go. He was very much in favor. The prime minister was very much in favor. In fact, I spoke to the prime minister personally. But the wife and daughter of the president of Uganda had been gotten to by the anti-GMO people. And there was a priest from Canada who convinced them that GMOs were dangerous. And the president refused to sign the bill. And it's now gone back to Parliament, and this still isn't available. Cassava is something, it suffers from something called brown streak disease. Quite difficult. We don't grow it very much in the West. No one in the West eats it. It's never been improved. But there are actually very good varieties now as a result of the GMO transfer of genes into cassava that will stop brown streak disease. Just another example of something where the GMO approach can very quickly give you what you want. Fall armyworm in South Africa. Fall armyworm is now spreading all over the place, but there is maize that is resistant to it. It is grown in South Africa, but again, the anti-GMO people convinced the leaders in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and so on that this was too dangerous and they shouldn't do it, even though South Africa is perfectly happy to do it. And in the West, we grow it all the time. In Bangladesh, BT eggplant. This is an eggplant that has had a gene, a bacterial gene from Bacillus thuringiensis called the BT gene, put it into the eggplant, and it stops insects from eating it. And this is actually used in many different kind of varieties. But now in Bangladesh, they grow so much eggplant, they can't eat it all, and so they're exporting it. In Hawaii, a big problem with papayas. There was a virus that was growing on papayas, destroying it. It too managed to get taken care of using a GMO method. This gentleman, Dennis Gonsalves, a long time ago, figured out he could put a gene into papaya that would make it resistant to the ring spot virus. And lo and behold, papayas are now sold widely in the US and in many places. They're GMO, never been any problem with any of them. And so that's a good thing. In Thailand, here, unfortunately, you're not allowed to grow GMOs. The farmers can't use any GMO products. They have exactly the same problem. They have a problem with this ring spot virus. The Hawaiian papaya modification doesn't actually work against the variety of ring spot here, but people in scientists in a neighboring country have made resistant varieties, and in fact, GMO papayas are now being grown here in Thailand because the farmers are smart. You don't always have to listen to the government in order to do what is the best for you. We have to remember that food choice is really a luxury of the developing world. Right? You go into a supermarket, you go into a restaurant. It's not a problem. You have plenty of food. But please, if you don't want to eat GMO crops for whatever reason, don't do it because you pretend they're dangerous. Just say, I choose not to. I had a lady, a librarian, who said to me one time, after I'd given a talk at the local library, she said, well, you know, I hear what you say and I think GMOs are okay, but I just don't like the idea of eating a plant that has a fish gene in it. And I said, well, you know, do you eat fish? And she said, oh, yes. And I said, do you eat plants? Oh, yes. I said, what do you think happens to the DNA when it gets into your stomach? You think there's no mixing of this DNA taking place? Oh, yes, well, I hadn't thought of that. So, you know, we really don't do a very good job of teaching our children about this. And in particular, if you think about the way that GMO foods are made, we take one gene, two genes, move it into a plant. We know what we've moved in. We know what they do. Traditional breeding doesn't do that. Traditional breeding picks up lots of genes that we don't know what they do, and that's why you have problems with it from time to time. For developed countries, food isn't a problem. But if we're going to start making statements and telling everybody that things are dangerous because it's good for local politics, we have to remember it gets out around the world. It's not a good idea to be using false science in order to promote decisions. And we need more science in politics, and it would be really nice if there was a little less politics in science. But I think the former of those statements is much truer. We need to make sure the politicians listen to the science. They should stop supporting the idea that foods produced by precision breeding methods, by the GMO methods, are bad. And I think we need to make sure that we connect with the politicians and that they listen to the science. You know, after all, why would they fund us? What is the point in funding us and then just ignoring the science that comes out of our laboratories? I think there are also a role for civil society. So the major religious leaders should speak out. I've been trying to get the Pope to make a statement about this, which I think would be very helpful in many countries. Groups such as the Rotary clubs, they usually are very concerned about the economics and the health of their local communities. They should speak out, and every time I've spoken to a Rotary club, they've been very pro-GMO. They think this is all good. Influential celebrities. It might be nice if some of these football players in Qatar at the moment could speak out about this. And I think the media really owe us. They should not pretend that this is a contentious issue. It's a settled issue. It is very hard to find any scientist who understands the science who will come out and say GMOs are dangerous. And we've got to make sure that we get this message through to the science media, and they shouldn't pretend that, oh, this is a nice issue for a debate. It really isn't. This is the best thing so far that's come out of the Catholic Church. I think if you know the Catholic rituals, one of them is the Eucharist, where you take bread and wine and pretend that it's, well, there are theological reasons for thinking that this is something good to do. They said, if this Eucharistic material, the bread and the wine, if it's made from GMO materials, it's okay. This is okay. So I thought that was pretty good, but we can't get the Pope to make a big statement to the same effect, at least not yet. I'm still working on that. And I like this idea, you know, have a heart. Non-GMO is a Western indulgence of the rich. It doesn't work for the poor in Africa or in Asia or in South America. They don't ask, what will I eat today? They don't ask, They don't ask, what will I eat today? They ask, will I eat today? Right? These 800 million people go to bed hungry. They want food. And here is a way in which they can make it. And the nice thing is that when it comes to the GMO approaches, scientists in the developing world can make these modifications for themselves. The methodology is simple, it's straightforward. This is something that they can do, they have been doing. You talk to scientists in Africa, they know how to do this. It's just the politicians that are causing the problems. And I'd like to close here. On the left is a book. It's sort of a biography of Mark Van Montague, which is very good, very interesting. Food Evolution is a movie that was produced by Scott Kennedy. It's available streaming these days and gives you both sides of the GMO story. And finally, on the right is a book by Ed Regis about the history of golden rice and everything that went on with it. All very good, very entertaining, factual accounts of what went on. And so I hope all of you will agree GMOs are safe. If you have any doubts, please come find me, talk to me. I'm happy to discuss this. Email me. I'm more than happy to discuss this. If you go to this website, supportprecisionagriculture.org, you can sign up and join us. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. This presentation is putting me into dilemma to in the gala to still, we are on the same page actually. So the issue is that that presentation has been repeated in many years, and I thought not to present it anymore. But in view of this presentation, I should really at least highlight some of the previous presentation I have done in last years. So this, there are numerous conclusions from this magnificent talk. So myths are everywhere, and it's politics that gets into the way sometimes enforcing myths in the society. And I was just curious, how they are able to convince the politicians without scientific data?
Well, I think the problem is the politicians, at least in democracies, are more interested in getting elected than they are in listening to science.
Well, I understand, but when they're
I mean, a good example is China. So the leaders of China are very pro-GMO. But there's been a tremendous amount of social media in China that has been anti-GMO. And the leaders were worried that if they forced their pro-GMO policies through, they would lead to unrest. Well, I think China's now figuring out they have some unrest, but they've already started a movement to use GMOs in China. But, you know, the politicians, even in autocracies, have to listen to the population if they don't want to get thrown out of office.
That's correct. But again, my question is, what's the way they convince politicians without scientific data? This is purely science. You cannot say, you know, well, you have to have data on the damage, you have to have the data on the diverse effects. Do they have this data?
No, of course not. It doesn't exist. But again, you have to recognize politicians listen to the people. I've talked to politicians about this, and they say, well, you convince my electorate that these things are safe, and then I'll be all for it.
Well,
right? And the answer there is we need to go to the children. I went to a children's school, 11, 12-year-olds, not too long ago, and gave a talk about GMOs. And they'd all been told they had to write to me afterwards and say what they thought about the talk. And there were 7 or 8 of them who wrote, and they said, well, this was the first time we've ever been spoken to as though we were adults. I thought this was a little telling about the teaching methods. But then one girl wrote to me and she said, I went home, I talked to my parents who were anti-GMO, I told them everything you'd said, and now they're pro-GMO. Okay? Yeah. So let's get to the children. The children really are pretty smart, you know, they're open-minded, they're much better at listening to facts and making their own conclusions than their parents.
That puzzles me. How can you convince someone without facts?
We have facts.
Yes, I mean the other, when they go to politicians and say against that.
You go to a movie, right? You go to one of these horror movies, and you get scared. You see what's going on by the end of it, and then at the end of it you say, oh, but it was only a movie. But you're pretty scared while you're watching the movie. Hollywood are very good at doing this.
Well, you know, 2 examples you mentioned. Politician life. Well, this is, I keep this saying all the time. I don't want to repeat myself, but since many of the audience is new here, they love today. They say we will make science-based decisions, okay? So, an example, in Germany, when they got rid of all nuclear reactors, the idea was that we took the decision based on science. Now, we have a presentation, if they would have been in our energy symposium since 2003, they would have seen that there is no single data that makes nuclear reactors risky or waste. There are two reasons they justify, risk and waste. This is, science can deal with this. But even on this point, we have a presentation compares nuclear reactor with all type of energy, and it's the safest one. Yeah. And it is the waste one. These are hard fact data. So it's easy to say I'm following science, and they do not. And today they accept it's too late. By the way, in Germany, it was the only one, it's a little bit different. Only the Green Party in Germany was against closing down the nuclear reactor. It's a little bit different because normally the Green Party are against that. But they are against the whole political class. The entire political class in Germany failed because they closed down nuclear reactor. Only the Green Party was against that. And the head of the Green Party, Reinhard Bütikofer, was honored by us in 2011 as with Frey International Sustainability Award. We spotted it 10 years before he went against the entire political class. And we have the data today that it's safe.
We just have to do a better job of picking politicians.
Because the scientists do not do the job. And
Well,
this
but
is
the problem is if you move scientists into politics, they become politicians. You just look. Almost everyone, Margaret Thatcher, right, goes into Parliament in England. She's a chemist. She's a chemist. And the first thing she does was to cut the science budget.
No, it's a physicist or chemist.
No, she was chemist.
Chemist?
Margaret
Okay.
Thatcher was a chemist.
Oh, Thatcher, so. But in Germany, it is...
That was a physicist.
Physicist, yes. But anyway, unfortunately, we have a very crowded gala dinner today. Let's have a picture for the record. So I cannot go in detail with my presentation.
He's been taking pictures.
Yes, well, but anyway, this is our official one. For the record, like lawyer says.
Okay,
Okay, thank you.